Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. I appreciate so much you being with me, and I got to get right into it because I've got an awful long way to go this morning. We're going to be focusing on Revelation 16, Revelation chapter 17, Revelation 14 first, as we continue our examination of the Olivet Discourse, specifically the parable of the wedding, the parable of the kingdom, and Matthew 25, 1 to 13. Now remember, the commentators tell us that Revelation depicts the time of the wedding. Okay, that's all fine and good. And we are told that Revelation posits the time of the wedding as sometime off in the future. All right? The end of the Christian age. Well, there's a problem with that, especially for the amillennialists and the postmillennialists. Because you see, many postmillennialists, men such as Kenneth Gentry, for instance, they take the time of the wedding as AD 70. Well, those same men such as Kenneth Gentry, they put the wedding of Revelation chapter 21 at AD 70, and then they go back to Matthew chapter 25, the Olivet Discourse, and they say that the parable of the 5 wise, 5 foolish virgins is the coming of the Lord at the end of time. Well, wait a minute. The coming of the Lord at Matthew chapter 25 is the coming of the Lord for the wedding. Does Mr. Gentry have 2 different weddings? Maybe it's 2 different sons. No, it's one wedding. It is therefore self-contradictory. It's unbiblical to say, oh yeah, Revelation posits the wedding of Christ in AD 70 with the death of the Old Covenant bride. But Matthew 25, now that's Christ coming at the end of the age, this age, Christian age. You see, the reality is that Mr. Gentry contradicts himself coming and going. It's almost like every time he sits down to write, he contradicts himself. Now, we're all prone to that. We're all human beings, okay? But in Revelation chapter 14, I want you to notice, now remember, we're sort of kind of focused here on the identity of Babylon because Babylon is destroyed, and the result of that, consequently flowing out of that, is the wedding of the Son of Man. Well, in Revelation 14, Babylon is fallen. Is fallen. Babylon the Great is fallen. Revelation 14, 6 and following. That destruction would happen at the time of the harvest foretold by John the Baptizer, who said it was at hand. It's the time of the harvest that Jesus said that time had already arrived, John 4:35. Now, watch this. Revelation 14, 17 and following. Another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle. And another came out from the altar, had power over fire, and cried with a loud cry to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, thrust in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the wine out of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. So the angel thrust his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine of the earth, and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trampled outside the city, and blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles for 1,600 furlongs. Now, I am obviously not going to get to Revelation 16 and 17 today. I'm sorry. You know, every time I sit down and I think I've got it all planned out, I start reading or I start thinking, I start talking, and I remember and I think about other information that I've been studying, and it kind of comes through as a flood. I want you to notice, who is Babylon? Remember, that's critical to understand the entire narrative of the wedding. Because Babylon is the harlot bride, is the harlot wife. Her destruction, her death gives way to the marriage of the Lamb. Well, this is at the time of the harvest. That is, her destruction is at the time of the harvest. Now, you have 2 angels depicted in verse 17 and 18. Another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle, and another came from the altar. Point number one. What altar is this? This is the altar of Revelation chapter 6. John said, I saw under the altar in the fifth seal the souls of those who had been beheaded for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried out, How long, O Lord, holy and true, do you not avenge us on those who dwell on the earth? And white robes were given unto them, and they were told to rest 40 or 50,000 years until their fellow brethren. Wait a minute. I'm sorry, I put a futurist wording into the text, didn't I? That they should rest for a little while. No, not 40 or 50,000 years. No, not 2,000 years. They should rest for a little while, until their fellow brethren and the saints who should be slain as they were should be filled up or should be fulfilled. Well, wait a minute. In Matthew 23, Jesus, standing in the temple where the altar was, the literal physical altar in the temple, which was a representation of the temple in heaven, Jesus said to the Jews of his day, of his generation, that all of the blood of all of the righteous shed upon the earth, all the way from Abel unto Zacharias son of Barachias, whom they killed between the temple and the altar, would be avenged in that generation. And he told them, the Jews, he was going to send them, his apostles, his prophets, his wise men. They would scourge, they would crucify, chase from city to city, that upon them would come all of that righteous blood. And he challenged them in a bit of awesome, terrible, foreboding rhetoric. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Here's see, God had three cups. Cup of sin on the part of the sinners, the persecutors. The cup of suffering on the part of his brethren, on the part of his faithful, of the believers. The cup of wrath to be poured out on the persecutors. And now here in Revelation 14, coming out from under the altar is an angel saying, Thrust in the sickle, the time of the harvest has come. Point number two. Folks, look, this is Matthew chapter 23 all over again. This is Revelation 6 all over again. Matthew 23, this generation. Revelation chapter 6, rest only for a little while. The judgment, the vindication of the martyrs, the judgment of their persecutors was not to be far off, not to be protracted or delayed. It was at hand. Point number two. Thrust in your sickle. Did you notice the language? The vine of the earth is fully ripe. Oh, wait a minute. You got the altar of the temple represented by the literal physical altar at the temple in Jerusalem. Just look at Hebrews chapter 9, 24 and following. The earthly represented the heavenly. And then you have the vine of the earth. Now listen, folks, this could take up several videos all within itself. But throughout the Tanakh, Old Covenant Israel is depicted as the vine of the Lord. In Jeremiah chapter 2, the Lord said he brought Israel out of the land of Egypt, and he planted her as a holy, right vine in the land of Israel. Yet they became corrupted and produced evil and wicked fruit. In Isaiah chapter 5, the Lord called Israel His holy vine. But she was producing evil and wicked fruit, and she was going to be destroyed. And thus Israel, the 10 northern tribes, had her harvest. She was completely destroyed as a kingdom. Now, Babylon, in Revelation, Judah, representative of the... Did you realize that in the temple at Jerusalem, inside the vestibule, visible from the outside, Josephus tells us that there was a cluster of grapes as tall as a man, with vines coming out of it and going down each side of the doorway. That cluster of grapes was of pure gold and was as tall as a man. Wow. I mean, it's just unimaginable to think about it, right? Why was that vine there? Did the Jews simply decide, oh, hey, guys, I got a great idea. Let's put up a vine? No. It is because the vine represented Israel. And now here in Revelation 14, and by the way, I discuss all of this in my book, Who is This Babylon? Okay? If you want to order that off of my website, just mention the fact that you saw me discuss this on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping and save you $5. But here, we have two powerful images. Number one, the angel coming out from under the altar, where the martyrs were. And the martyrs were to be avenged in the first century generation. Number two, we have the judgment of the vine, which is nothing more, nothing less, nothing other than Old Covenant Judah. It's Judah by the first century. Israel's vine has already been cut down. The imagery here is virtually overwhelming. So the question therefore becomes, if the time of the harvest is the time of the wedding, if the time of the harvest is the time of the judgment of Babylon, which then segues to the time of the wedding, then how can we go to Matthew chapter 25 and the imagery of the wedding and say, oh, well, okay, maybe Revelation 14 does talk about Israel and Judah and AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah, but Matthew 25 is different. Really? Wherein? When one of the keynote words of Revelation is watch, just like in Matthew 25, the virgins had to watch. There's no way that we can properly, exegetically, logically divorce Matthew 25 from Revelation 14. And thus, there's no way that we can make Revelation 14 refer to the end of time and the harvest of the literal physical globe. And if we can't make Revelation 14 an end of time coming of the Lord at the destruction of the globe and the harvest of the vine, then we can't make Matthew 25 to be that kind of judgment either. All right. Thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. Okay, tomorrow we'll get to Revelation 16 and 17, focus even more sharply on who is this Babylon that had to be destroyed, had to be punished, had to be put to death for the wedding to take place. I'll see you on the flip side.